congratulations on the 12th Balipara Foundation Forum. My best contribution would be to try to offer some global context to the challenges and indeed the opportunities of the region. We have to begin, of course, with recognizing that the third pole, the Himalaya are the third pole, and what we're talking about is a region affected by all this with well over half the world's population. This third pole is much more central numerically and geographically than the other two poles, of course, important though the other two poles are. So I thought situating this third pole, given it's more than half the world's population affected, situating that in a global context might be helpful. So let me start with the COP29 and indeed look forward to COP30. As we speak, as I'm speaking now, COP29 is continuing in Baku in Azerbaijan. I was there last week. I was particularly putting ideas about finance into the COP discussions, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. But COP29, of course, took place in the context of a result in the USA national election, which clearly is not good for environment, climate, and biodiversity, given that President Trump regards the whole idea of climate change as a hoax. So that is not positive for the story of driving towards net zero, managing climate change, and looking after our biodiversity. At the same time, we should not get too down. Whilst recognizing that it's not helpful, we should also recognize that we've been through this once before. Maybe this one will be different. Probably it'll be different. But the last time round, after President Trump was elected in November 2016, we were actually gathered at COP22 in Marrakesh in Morocco. And the immediate reaction, including from our American friends, were, we are still in, we carry on. So the cities and states of the United States, covering well over half the emissions and the national income of the United States, said, we carry on, we get on with it. If you look at Texas, they are the biggest investors across the United States in solar and wind. Why? Because it's cheaper and they've got a lot of sunshine and a lot of wind. They're not doing it because they're in love with the Paris Agreement. They're doing it because it's a cheaper way of generating electricity. So one of the differences between the election in November 2016 and the election in November of 2024 is that the whole set of opportunities have opened up much more. The costs of the clean technologies have come down, and across at least a third of emissions, the clean is cheaper than the dirty, and within 7 or 8 years, that will be true, probably of 2/3 of the emissions. The story of building in a cleaner way is actually also a story about efficiency, and efficiency is productivity, is growth and development. Cities where you can move and breathe are more productive than cities where you cannot. Ecosystems which are robust and fruitful are indeed exactly that. They're fruitful. They allow more production and better health and so on. So we're talking now about a change, a set of changes which has real momentum. So whilst that momentum will be damaged in the short run by the results of the US election, that momentum will continue and keep going, even though life for a while will get a little more difficult in that direction. I do think that COP30 is going to be a very important COP, and we can see COP29 as an important stepping stone on the way to COP30, where probably the results in COP30 will be a bigger and a greater significance, and the leadership of Brazil is already very strong. A lot of the story, as I've already described it, of acting on climate change is about investment. It's investment in the energy transition. It's investment in adaptation and resilience. It's finding resources to tackle loss and damage. And of course, of great importance, it's investment in our natural capital, in our forests and our lands and our rivers and our wildlife, our biodiversity, and so on. So this is an investment story. Investment needs to be financed. And with Amar Bhattacharya and Veera Songwe, we presented a paper in Baku on the amount of investment that would be necessary and the way in which that investment could be financed. And within that investment story, we looked at how much by geography and sector of investment would be necessary to deliver on Paris, focusing on emerging markets and developing economies outside China simply because finance is not the issue for China, but China, of course, extremely important for the world. And we did look at that, and we argued that the external flow of resources would have to be about $1 trillion a year by 2030, and that could be made up of half private sector, absolutely critical, and probably that's 500 billion, 250 billion from the multilateral development banks, and 250 billion from a number of sources of very low cost or zero cost money. That's overseas development assistance, it's voluntary carbon markets, it's philanthropy, it's special drawing rights, it's new forms of taxation and so on. So that was our story of external finance, and we showed that all of that is actually possible. But the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, have special importance in helping to manage the risk and reduce the risk and share the risk so that the private sector could come in more strongly and help build the infrastructure which would enable the private sector to come in. So that's the story of finance. If you'd like to look at that, please go to the Grantham Research Institute website at the London School of Economics, and you can see the paper on climate finance that we presented at COP29 in Baku last week. But do remember that the route to COP30 is well underway, and that Brazil will show real leadership at COP30, and that biodiversity will be at absolutely center stage. And given that the third pole is at the center of the story of biodiversity, Brazil also in its own way, but I do think that the third pole could and should be a major focus of attention at COP30. Let me turn quickly to recent experience of the main countries here. I've worked a lot in China over the years. I've worked in China for more than 35 years and in India now for more than 50 years. But the progress that China has made in the last 5 years or so has been, excuse me, the progress that China has made in the last 5 years or so has been absolutely remarkable. I think they're peaking their emissions about now. The fraction of electric vehicles sold in China in the middle part of this year has been over 50%. They are putting in each year around 250 or 300 gigawatts of renewables, majority solar, but also wind. That's quite remarkable. Per year, 250 or 300 gigawatts of renewables. The total capacity altogether in the UK is about 80 gigawatts. So they really are pushing very hard on electric vehicles, on clean energy, and also we should recognize that they are reforesting in a strong way also. I think China's emissions are peaking about now, and during the crucial 15th five-year plan, which is 2026 to 2030, those emissions will be falling. And that will be very important for the world. And of course, the natural capital part of that story will be of great significance, along with, of course, the clean energy and electric vehicles and so on. So China's moving. I had the great privilege of seeing my old friend Mohammed Yunus, the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, in Baku last week. And of course, climate change was right at the front, and biodiversity loss were right at the front of Yunus's agenda. Very interestingly, he focused also on the gender implications of climate change and biodiversity loss. If you look at most of the places of impact of climate change, it's women and girls who are hit earliest and hardest. And I'll come back to that because we can see the reasons why that's the case, although I guess it's pretty obvious how they are the most vulnerable. But they also have real opportunities, for example, through decentralized solar. Salinity and loss of land was right at the front of the mind of Prime Minister Mohamed Yunus. And of course, if you start losing land in a very intensely populated place, which of course Bangladesh is very densely populated, then the whole issue of migration moves right to the top of the set of challenges. Bangladesh is getting hit from both sides. It gets the glacier melt and the torrents, and it gets the storm surges, the sea level rise, and the salinity. The issue of migration from Bangladesh will be absolutely central, and it will be a challenge for the whole world, particularly, of course, for India, but it will be a challenge for the whole world. And it's good that at the moment, at least, Bangladesh has a prime minister for whom this issue is absolutely key. Turning to India, I had the privilege of working on India's G20 presidency last year, and that was really focused on sustainable development. India put that at center stage, and it came from the Prime Minister himself, and of course the G20 Sherpa, Amitabh Kant, together with other key ministries across India. That momentum that India generated for its G20 presidency is very important. And I urge my Indian friends, and there are many, of course, right there with you at this forum, to push very hard to keep that momentum generated during India's G20 presidency last year at center stage. India, for example, initiated the very important report by N.K. Singh and Larry Summers. I had the privilege to be part of that group on the way in which the multilateral development banks could become bigger and bolder and better in order to take that all forward. So that's the story of a very quick look around the world. But let me finish by re-emphasizing the importance of the interactions and intimate relationship between biodiversity and climate change, and alongside the vulnerabilities. Biodiversity loss, climate change have common drivers. Of course, the burning of fossil fuels and the pollution that comes from that is very damaging for climate change, very damaging for biodiversity. Deforestation is bad for the climate, and it's bad for biodiversity. So those are two, and there are more, but those are two very big common drivers of biodiversity loss and climate change. If you look at the way in which biodiversity and climate change interact, biodiversity loss causes climate change causes biodiversity loss in all sorts of complicated, but I hope fairly obvious ways. So that story of common drivers, that story of mutual interaction so that one loss reinforces the other loss, is extremely important in thinking about policy, thinking about deep reforestation, thinking about restoring degraded land, thinking about cutting back on those things that are damaging the both biodiversity and climate. So let's close then by just reminding ourselves of all the ways in which that vulnerability occurs. There's extreme heat, changing rainfall, droughts, groundwater, glacier melt, sea level rise and salinity, the changing environment for agriculture, energy security, water security, health, migration and conflict. Those are the areas that we usually think of as the impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss. And this region, this crucial region, the third pole, is vulnerable to all those things. And within that context, there are certain groups, the poorest groups, women and girls, who are the most vulnerable. And it's also the case, and let me close on an optimistic note, that changing our ways, doing things differently, finding this different way of growing and developing, which breaks the damaging relationship between development and environmental damage and turns it round and shows that sustainable development can look after both living standards and our environment. And indeed, it gains from doing both. There is no horse race between our environment, biodiversity, and climate on the one hand, and development across all its dimensions on the other. Quite the opposite. They come together, they mutually reinforce. And this is the new model of development, which can be so much more attractive than the dirty, destructive models of the past. So wishing you again in the wonderful third pole, that very special region of the world, wishing you a very productive and enjoyable 12th Balipara Forum. Thank you.